So here we are with the Age of Exploration. Something we need to be aware of is that there's a lot of stuff happening at the same time. So the Age of Exploration is going on at the same time as like the Renaissance is wrapping up and the Protestant Reformation is going on and the religious wars, as a result of the Protestant Reformation. A lot of this stuff is taking place at the exact same time. So these years are going to start to overlap before we're able to move on. So, the Age of Exploration. Europeans had long been the recipients of Eastern goods. Referring to the East sort of generally as just China and India, Europeans felt these goods were part of luxurious living. You had to pay money, right? You got to pay a lot of money in order to get stuff from China or stuff from India. The most popular items imported were silks, carpets, pottery, jewels. Probably the most popular was spices. Spices. Who doesn't love spices, right? While traveling, explorers largely used Ptolemy's geography, and this is a rendition of Ptolemy's geography here. This is a map that Ptolemy drew of what he thought the world looked like. And let me just say, without having any sort of, advanced instruments and things like that, it's pretty stinking good. He thought the world was a globe, again, so not flat, consisting of 3 continents, Asia, Africa, and Europe. And he thought the world consisted of only 2 oceans, the Indian Ocean and the Western Ocean. Now, other than these eras, Ptolemy also suggested that land covered about 3/4 of the Earth's surface and that the Earth was about 1/6 smaller than its actual size. With this map's many errors, sailors underestimated the time it would take to sail to the east, and they also didn't quite understand what would have to be gone through in order to get to the east. That stated, it's still pretty amazing that he came up with this map. I mean, that's pretty awesome. The main theme of exploration during this time is glory, God, and gold. Some explorers wanted their 10 minutes of fame, some wanted to spread Christianity for numerous reasons, and others wanted to strike it rich. Constantinople fell in 1453 to the Turks. The Turks then placed a huge tax on luxury items coming from the east and being traded through its city, which was renamed to Istanbul. European monarchs were running out of money in the 16th century, and they offered rewards to anyone willing to brave the seas in order to get the crown more jewels and precious metals. Portugal wound up paving the way for European explorers. Not only did they develop modern sailing technology, which offered more safety and accuracy, they were in essence the first to truly explore the seas. Beginning in 1418, Prince Henry the Navigator sponsored expeditions down the coast of Africa. Vasco da Gama was probably the first, however, truly successful explorer when he finally reached India and returned with spices worth 60 times the cost of his ship. On da Gama's second voyage to India, he took casks of gunpowder to use as trade, which ultimately created an arms race, which would cause violence to escalate in the 15 and 1600s. Fortunately for the Portuguese, India was not just one location. The Spice Islands, or the Moluccas, were very rich in spices. Again, probably the most sought-after luxury item from the East. The Portuguese therefore set up trading outposts, which were basically just European settlements. Seeing the Portuguese success, other countries wanted to copy and compete with Portugal. Spain closely followed Portugal in the race for glory, God, and gold. In 1476, Christopher Columbus traveled to Portugal to learn about shipbuilding and sailing. He became infatuated with sailing to distant lands, but was rejected by the Portuguese king when he asked for financing for a voyage. Spain's monarchs, however, and this would be Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs, they did not dismiss him, and in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. He sailed with the 3 famous ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. When he landed in the Caribbean, he claimed the land for his monarchs, and since the natives who had come up to look at him didn't disagree, he figured they were fine with the new arrangement. That's sarcasm, because, they couldn't speak his language, so whatever. He was so convinced that he found India in the east that he referred to the natives as Indians. On his third voyage, he brought women in order to establish a permanent settlement, but Columbus was a terrible administrator and was returned to Spain in handcuffs. He made one final voyage to what he still thought was the East, but he never became rich or famous, except, of course, like to us. Those who followed Columbus realized that he had actually found a new continent, and not the East after all. The Catholic and the Portuguese monarchs were each vying for great wealth and other gains through their naval adventures. So, of course, they began to clash with each other. In 1494, they sought the Pope's help, and they all agreed to the Treaty of Tordesillas, which basically drew a line that divided what they thought the earth was. Spain got west of the line, and Portugal got the eastern side. Other countries didn't really pay attention to this treaty, but they weren't included in the treaty anyway, so, who cares? The most well-known explorer who sought the New World was Amerigo Vespucci, and it is his name that our continent and the Southern American continent hold. Vespucci worked for the de' Medici family in Florence and was considered very much a real Renaissance man. During a voyage to South America, he took very careful measurements. After Vespucci popularized America, many adventurers sought to explore what came to be called the New World. Now that everyone was aware that Columbus's East was actually a new continent and it had a name, America, more explorers set out really just to explore the new continent. Spain's Vasco de Balboa eventually crossed the Pacific Ocean, and the race to find a quicker route to the east really only intensified. After de Balboa, Ferdinand Magellan began a trip around the world. He left in 1519 with 3 ships, rounded the southern tip of South America, which he named the Straits of Magellan. His ship became the first to circumnavigate the globe, but he did not make it, because in 1521 he decided to intervene in the Filipino War and ultimately was killed. His navigator, however, did finish the journey back to Spain, and with this successful voyage, the Europeans were finally fully aware of how big the world actually is. England, France, and the Netherlands also wanted a piece of the pie. They're dragging behind just a little bit, but they began their own explorations in the 1600s, and they all hoped, once again, for an even quicker passage to the east. From England, we see Henry VII employing a father-son team to claim any land that was not already claimed by another European nation. So John Cabot and his son Sebastian reached North America, but never reached Asia, nor did they find any great riches anywhere. As time progressed, the English established colonies in North America. By 1700s, there was approximately like 250,000 English colonists living in North America, and most of them moved there in order to escape religious persecution. In 1534, Frenchman Jacques Cartier led 3 enterprises to North America, trying to find a northwest passage to the east. But, of course, they never found one, so they tried to settle. The first settlements in the Quebec area failed because of climate and hostilities with local Native Americans. But the subsequent Canadian settlements did become permanent, even if they did remain small. The Dutch were fairly dismayed that there was no Northwest Passage, but the main North American settlement was in modern-day Manhattan Island, and they also made strategic settlements in the Caribbean and South Africa. The Dutch were pretty intent on winning, and they eventually forced the Portuguese out of the Indian Spice Islands, dominating the spice trade. So the Dutch are not to be outdone. Here you can see European expansion circa 1700. So that which is in green, that's Spain. So Spain has a great, where's my hand? There it is. A great deal of control over here in these regions, right? So modern-day Mexico, going down along the Gulf of Mexico, coming into the southwest of modern-day United States, moving down to the western portion of South America. The Portuguese are in orange, so you can see they've got areas in Brazil, and they're also over here in southern Africa. The French are in this reddish color, so the French have a great deal of modern-day Canada, as well as a few, excuse me, that's England. The Brits have a great portion of modern-day Canada by about 1700, along with the eastern seaboard of modern-day United States. The French are in yellow, and the French have a huge portion of the North American continent by way of what eventually has come to be known as the Louisiana Territory. So the world is sort of being carved up between these different European powers. When the Europeans arrived in Central and South America, they did find a very rich agricultural system in place. The major crops grown and coveted by Europeans were potatoes, tobacco, and coffee, which were all very new to European peoples. Although these native populations greatly outnumbered the European explorers, Europeans held great advantage in several areas. Their biggest assets were horses, their administrative abilities, steel weapons, gunpowder, and probably most importantly, some would argue with that, but germs. Germs play a huge role. By using all of this, sometimes without realizing it, and with the enslavement of so many Native Americans, the native population rapidly decreased. While the Europeans sort of traipsed over the continents, there was a rise in mixed-race children, as well as the introduction of an English weed, the dandelion. So, thanks a lot, English, for that weed. So we're seeing a confrontation of cultures as well as the combination. We're seeing things beginning to intermingle. The major native empires located in South America were the Maya, the Aztec, and the Inca. When European explorers arrived, they mostly used the native peoples in whatever way would bring the most profit. Sometimes that meant trade, but other times it meant slavery. Spanish soldiers of fortune were called conquistadors, and Hernando Cortez is one of the most famous conquistadors in history. When he arrived in Mexico, he heard about the Aztec people and that they were fabulously wealthy. The Aztecs were the military power of the region, and Cortez knew he would need to conquer them before being able to harvest any of their riches. A key fact learned was that many of the peoples subject to the Aztecs deeply resented the tribute imposed upon them. They had to pay, right? Sometimes not just with money, other times in people. And so they were, where am I going with this? They're deeply resentful of what they're having to do. And there are others who are actually warring against the Aztec at the same time. Now, Cortez, very much an astute politician, he would exploit these ethnic and regional divisions, which only persisted under Spanish rule. On November 8th, 1519, the Spaniards were received by Montezuma in the city of Tenochtitlan. Although they were impressed by the city, this magnificent city, and Montezuma's control of such a huge empire, Cortez was concerned about what might happen to his forces should Montezuma's control falter, which later it did. Spaniards eventually were obliged to flee Tenochtitlan during the night of June 30th, losing more than half their forces and nearly all of their plunder. But after about a year, the Aztec Empire did in fact fall. As Europeans entered the Americas, Native Americans were many times forced to labor for Europeans. They were enslaved by the Europeans. Now, this number is rather high. We're really not sure how many people actually were living on the continents. But there are some scholars who place the number as high as 24 million Native Americans who died from disease, abuse, and overwork. Because so many Native Americans died, Europeans began to think that they were not useful as a labor force. So when the Europeans found that sugarcane grew very well here, another one of those crops highly coveted by Europeans, they needed workers for their huge sugar plantations. So they turned their eyes toward Africa, and the development of the African slave trade began, or the transatlantic slave trade, I should say. The transatlantic slave trade began in 1532 and lasted well into the 1700s. In the Americas, the result was a steady supply of free labor, whose immune systems were stronger than that of the Native Americans. In Africa, the results were varied at first, but eventually it was all the same. At first, some African tribes benefited economically and politically participating in the slave trade because it was coastal African tribes and towns which would go further inland and kidnap other Africans in order to trade to Europeans. So at first, we see African tribes benefiting, once again, economically and politically, while participating in the slave trade. But after the trade ended, all these wealthier tribes fell into disarray and near collapse. We refer to slavery as the peculiar institution. Slavery was in existence since biblical times. This is not a brand new idea. The Europeans did not come up with this or anything like that. This has been around since the dawn of time. And so people are starting to reap the consequences of this horrible institution. Now, many times there were slave insurrections in which enslaved peoples would fight their way free and establish settlements of their own. But slaves also rebelled in other ways. Some enslaved women practiced birth control so that they would not bring children into slavery. Many field laborers would start to work very slowly. So lots of different ways in order to rebel against one's master. Again, our theme is glory, God, and gold, right? So we do see missionaries in the New World. Not there to gather people, not there to gather goods, but to gather souls. The spread of Christianity was important to them for various reasons. They didn't always have to deal with God. Many times these missionaries would present Christianity in native forms, with the Catholic Church molding to its surrounding people groups' whims. And so we start to see the Catholic Church in particular coming under or experiencing some slight transformations. So, for example, native peoples start painting darker-skinned saints. Caribbean converts converged African religious traditions with new Roman Catholic traditions, and Asian converts continued to venerate their ancestors. So lots of things happening. But I wanted to bring out two missionaries in particular that I just enjoy reading about. First, we have Marie, and I can't say her last name, or what would be like her surname. So we're just gonna call her Marie. Marie was a French nun working in Canada among Native girls. She established schools, and the idea was to train them, to educate them in such a way that they would grow to become good Christian women with strong Christian homes, and that these women would help sort of to lead in the creation of a moral society in the New World. And then we have Pedro from Portugal, who worked among the African slaves. He very much disliked the way African slaves were treated, and worked very closely among them to the point of establishing a leper colony. And he went and lived among the lepers in order to minister to them, both spiritually and physically, eventually succumbing to death. Well, I was about to pass this up. Let's talk about this painting. This is glory, God, and gold. Okay, so we're talking about, we talked about Cortez. He's getting this glory, and Columbus and others, they're getting glory because they're exploring and they're adventurers, and they're getting their name out there. Then we're talking about God. We've got these missionaries going out and gathering souls. So now let's talk about gold. This painting, I really enjoy this painting. Girl with the Pitcher. This painting offers insight to the new wealth Europeans gained as they explored the world. Now, I have a lot of students who say, oh, she must be a nun because of what she's wearing on her head. No, she's not a nun. In fact, she is part of this new growing middle class, which is experiencing drastic economic growth. So, like on the wall in the background, she has decoration on the wall. I mean, who spends money on that? People who have disposable income. Look at what she's holding. She's holding a stained glass window. This is not just a window. This is not just a big hole in the wall. This is a decorative window. She's got money to spend. She's holding other implements. She's wearing a lovely everyday dress, probably made of silk. So this girl has got money to spend, and whoever is paying for this painting, they want people to see that not only do we have all this stuff, but guess what? We can also afford to have an artist come in and paint us with all of our stuff. The population growth encouraged the importation of more luxury goods, and as the population rose, the goods become scarce, giving rise to inflation. With the demands for goods came ambitious entrepreneurs looking to capitalize on people's desires, and these people are called capitalists. They chose to invest their funds in business activities in order to make more money or more capital. However, as with the tide, the desire and supply of goods ebbed and flowed. So, for example, tulips were in high demand at one point, but 3 years later, because there were so many, the price went down drastically. Therefore, several people are left with warehouses full of tulips. In order for more people to be involved in world trading, we see joint stock companies being formed. This new economic structure allowed ordinary investors to buy shares in commercial ventures that were run by boards of directors. And these joint stock companies made it easier to raise enough capital for trading ventures around the world. And that's a quote from your textbook. So this is, joint stock companies are owned by everyday people, not necessarily by the nobility, not necessarily by the fabulously wealthy, but everyday people who have made somewhat of a name for themselves or somewhat of a living through this new trade that's beginning to take place. And joint stock companies have a great deal of power because they can buy, they can sell, and they can wage war in order to protect their interests while they're out and about. They can't go and talk to the king on a regular basis. They can't go to get permission from the board of directors for different things, right? So they are able to do whatever it is they need to do in order to increase their trade and to protect their interests. As European culture spread, so did some European plants. Again, we talked about the dandelions, but also wheat, mustard, mint, chamomile, all of that begins to come in. Again, there's a rise in mixed-race children. There are new foods from the New World, potatoes from the Incas, tomatoes and corn, new stimulants such as chocolate, tea, and coffee. And the most popular and most influential new product is tobacco. So there's a lot of give and take, which is happening in this age of exploration, and we begin to see cultures drastically changing in order to meet new demands, in order to meet new intermingling of cultures, and it also gives rise to some scientific observation and thought because of elaborate descriptions of plant and animal life from the New World. So we start to see, even academically, things are changing. As the world came into view, we see Mercator maps replacing Ptolemy's geography as the map of choice when traveling around the world. A Flemish cartographer developed this highly detailed map. It was still with its flaws, the major flaw being that Europeans still saw themselves as the center of the world with everything surrounding them. So I think this is a great place for us to leave off. Our next lecture, we are going to be talking about some changes on the political horizon.